Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. I was just speaking to a few of you earlier about how this is the first in-person in a bookstore author event that I personally have hosted since March 5th of 2020, and the last one was 3,000 miles away. So it's been a journey, and thank you. Thank you to all of you for being here. I know that many of you have been to many wonderful readings in this space, and thank you so much for coming back and for joining us, for joining myself and Emma in the back for our first author event as new owners of the Norwich Bookstore. We are delighted to welcome you all back into this space, and we promise there will be many, many more. And we're so glad to have such a wonderful local author to be our inaugural author event. So thank you to Edith Forbes. Before we begin, I have just a couple of housekeeping announcements to get out of the way, and I will make myself as quick as possible. This is also one of those moments where I have to remember all the things I used to say when introducing authors. But the first one is pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. I say it a lot, and I will say it again. The first announcement is about books. We have this wonderful memoir, Tracking a Shadow by Edith Forbes, for sale tonight. It is the book we are talking about this evening. Many of you, I know, have already picked it up. Many of you started ordering this book back at the end of last year when it was first announced. We had quite a hefty pre-order game for this one. Thank you so much for supporting your local authors and your local bookstores. If you don't have a copy, or if you need another one, they make great gifts. Save them up for whatever gift giving you need to do this year. We've got copies over on the display right behind you in our main room, and we encourage you to pick up 1 or 5, and Edith would be happy to sign and personalize books tonight as you see fit. Book selling, book sales, that's really what it's all about here. It's what makes this whole bookstore machine run. It is what keeps small presses like Girl Friday Productions, who published this wonderful book, in business, and it is also what keeps authors like Edith Forbes writing and working. It makes this whole thing happen. So thank you so much for your book purchase and for your support. It's also gives you a great book at the end of the day, so everybody wins. If I can ask you to please turn off any cell phones, pagers, electronic devices that you might have at this time that could make noise. If you've got a musical instrument, now is the time to store it, so we can give our full attention to our speaker this evening. And while I've got you here as a captive audience, I'll also remind you that we are on track to do a lot of these this year. So if you enjoyed tonight's event, if you would like to see others online and in the bookstore and off-site at various places around the Upper Valley, I encourage you to check out our website. That's norwichbookstore.com. You can also sign up for our email newsletter there, and once a week we'll send you an update on what we've got going on, and I hope we'll see you back here time and time again. I'd also like to just really briefly say thank you to CATV for being here tonight. They are a wonderful Upper Valley resource that we have, community television. They're taping tonight's event. They are just awesome. What a resource we have in CATV in this community for access to information and for free speech and for all sorts of really important stuff. So check them out as well, and thank you, CATV, for being here tonight. Now, because we have CATV here tonight, we are using a microphone for Q&A as well as for talking. So at the end of the evening, when we do Q&A, I'm going to pass around this tiny, tiny little microphone. It won't make a big noise or anything, but what it will do is help your question be picked up for the cameras. So raise your hand if you have a question. We'll pass you the microphone so that we can make sure we get the whole thing on tape. And thank you very, very much for your cooperation. And now, without further ado, I'm going to get out of the way and introduce an author I am just delighted to be hosting this evening. I'm going to introduce her as Edith Forbes, although very few of you probably know her under that name. I know this is a friendly crowd tonight, but we are so glad to have Edith Forbes with us. She grew up on a family ranch in Wyoming, which you will hear about tonight, and graduated from Stanford University with a degree in English. She went on to write novels, 4 of them: Alma Rose, Noel's Passing, Exit to Reality, and Navigating the Darwin Straits, and now a memoir, Tracking a Shadow, My Lived Experience with MS. Recently retired from farm life, she lives right here in the Upper Valley, where she's a friend and neighbor to many of you. And we are so grateful to her for being here and launching her book with us tonight. Please join me in giving a warm Norwich Bookstore welcome to Edith Forbes. You can take this off if you want.
Hi, thank you all for being here. If there's someone I haven't recognized because their mask is so eye-catching, I hope you'll call my attention to it later. I guess I'll just start off reading, but mostly I'm just so glad you're all here. It's great to see you. And also I will really welcome questions afterwards. That would be so. I'm going to read a little. Well, I'm going to read from three different parts of the book. The beginning, where it sort of gives an idea of how the book came to be, and then some of my family background that is relevant to sort of how I dealt with the situation, and then a little bit about my medical journey. So it's sort of, there are different threads weaving through the book, and I'm trying to give a sample of different ones. Preface. Folk Dance Weekend, Beckett, Massachusetts. Like many people at the camp, the man ahead of me in the lunch line was at once familiar and a stranger. We had met in the whirl of the dance floor, briefly clasping hands to make circles and allemans, or wrapping arms around each other to swing, but we had not conversed. I knew only that he was a light-footed dancer with a bright smile. Around us, the dining hall crowd was fizzing with happy energy, and when the stranger turned to speak to me, I anticipated a cheerful remark about the music or where we lived. "I keep looking at you," he said, "because you look so much like a friend of mine who just died." How does one respond to such an opening? The conventional "I'm sorry" might sound like "I'm sorry I look like your friend." Asking the obvious questions, who was the friend, how did she die, seemed intrusive. Seeing that I was in a muddle, he quickly added, "It's good that you look like my friend. She was a lovely person, and I'm glad to be reminded of her. She was my doctor, as well as a close friend." Was she the same age we are? She was 54, a few years younger than me. So it was untimely. Did she have cancer, I asked? The automatic guess for a female younger than 60. Breast, ovarian, cervical. No, she had multiple sclerosis. I flinched. That's a little spooky, I said, because I have multiple sclerosis. Now he was the one at a loss, and I could almost see the thought balloon over his head. "I've just ruined your weekend." I smiled and assured him that I wasn't troubled by what he'd said. I was just startled by the coincidence. He said, "I also had a great aunt who'd had MS. She died of it when she was 93. We laughed. To anyone familiar with the wild variability of multiple sclerosis, this was an old joke. At one extreme, the disease has cases like that reported in my local newspaper a few years ago. A college student diagnosed at age 20 and dead at age 22. At the other extreme, it has the 93-year-old great aunt. In the middle, it has the 54-year-old friend, a physician who presumably had up-to-date information and plenty of access to medical care before she died. The disease follows many pathways, and one can't know ahead of time which path it will take. When my new acquaintance made the joke about his great aunt, he was trying to banish the frightening specter he thought he had raised. In fact, he had not caused me any new anxiety. I had known for 2 decades that my disease could change from benign to devastating at any time. What he had done was to reawaken an idea. Sometime before that dance weekend, I had been in a gap between projects, and my brother said, "Why don't you write about your experience with multiple sclerosis? I'll bet people would be interested." I said, "I haven't had any experience. I'm perfectly healthy." He said, that's just the point. So I'm going to skip ahead to when I found out when I first had my episodes of MS, which were in late 1993 and early 1995. I had 2 episodes, and after the first one, I just went to my family doctor, and he said, it could be a lot of things, let's see if it comes back. And there isn't anything to do about it anyway, so don't, And then in 95, he said I should go see a neurologist. And there still wasn't there still weren't any medical treatments for it. And I had some tests, but not comprehensive, but it was pretty strong indications that it was what I had, but I didn't have a formal diagnosis at that point. But how I handled it in some ways relates to my background, and I was going to read a little bit about that. Although both doctors had said there was nothing to be done, I was not content with this answer. I needed to do something. If nothing else, I could study meditation in order to be at peace with helplessness. I was raised by a mother who viewed any barricade in her path as something to be overcome, whether by leaping over it, by bulldozing it flat, or most commonly by locating the person who knew where there was a gate. She could be stoic, but she was never passive. Both of my parents came from old Boston families. They grew up in a world where private schools, travel, and household staff were the norm, but the women wore sensible shoes, and the only purpose of shopping was to replace objects that had worn out. In the 1930s, my father became interested in ranching and began spending more and more of his time in Wyoming. In 1939, my mother dropped out of Vassar College to marry him. Together, they left New England behind and settled in Wyoming for good. My father had attended Harvard in the era when admission was based on pedigree more than merit. On his ranch, he embarked on an experiment in the opposite direction. He wanted to evaluate cattle based on their practical merit rather than their pedigree. He hoped to develop a working model of scientific selection methods that would revolutionize cattle breeding. 8 years into his experiment, and a year before I was born, my father was diagnosed with lung cancer. Over the next 2 years, the family shuttled back and forth between Wyoming and Massachusetts, as my father was in and out of the hospital. When my father died, some of my mother's relatives urged her to sell the ranch in Wyoming and bring her children permanently back to Boston, where she would have the support of a large extended family. My mother did not follow their advice. She loved Wyoming and thought it was a good place for kids to grow up. She wanted to carry on the dream my father was pursuing when he died. Her situation as a single mother whose 7 children ranged in age from 14 years down to 14 months didn't stop her, nor did the conservative male-dominated culture of the 1950s beef industry, which did not welcome a woman with bright ideas. She simply didn't accept other people telling her what was possible. When I was about 7 years old, a woman who briefly worked in our household described my mother as a tornado. I instantly hated the woman and was ready to scratch her eyes out. Years later, I might have used the same word myself. My mother needed to be a tornado. Along with the idealistic dream of bringing innovation to agriculture, my father's death had left her with the daily reality of 7 children, several hundred head of cattle, a crew of employees and their families, and a large expanse of land that, in addition to grass, yucca, and wildlife, held an array of barns, fences, machinery, and irrigation ditches, all needing maintenance. Throughout my childhood, she had too much to do and far too little time. Just the family and the business made for a full load, never mind changing the world. Being a bookish introvert, I found her energy exhausting and sometimes embarrassing. Of all the parents in our rural neighborhood, she was the only one who showed up dressed in a costume for the Halloween party at our 2-room elementary school. And it wasn't a regular costume with a commercial witch's mask or a princess tiara. It was a bizarre homemade concoction consisting of a mop for a wig, a red bandana masking her face, a voluminous green poncho covering her body from head to foot, and my great-grandfather's Union Army cavalry sword in her hand. Fortunately, the year was 1966, and everyone in the neighborhood knew her, so nobody called the police. The thing about parents, though, is that we are them, whether we like it or not. My mother was adventurous, impatient, energetic, tenacious, and skeptical of authority. I can be all of those things, too. Every attribute in her that bugged me is also part of me. Another part of me is the product of a ghost. I was only a year old when my father died, but he was a presence in our household throughout my childhood, as our ranch continued the experiment he had launched. In farming generally, there is no separation between livelihood and daily life. One lives in the workplace, and one's schedule is governed by the weather and the tasks at hand. In our case, the ranch and the cattle became a laboratory, and our house was the place where the information from my father's experiment was recorded and analyzed. Computers were far in the future. Measurements were tabulated with pens and rulers on legal-sized pads of paper, and stacks of my mother's papers were scattered all over our house. She kept a portable office table in the living room, so she could work there while my brother and I played with plastic farm animals and toy trucks on the rug. The moment we were old enough to do math, we were recruited to help with the papers. We learned the vocabulary of what was known as performance testing, and terms like adjusted weaning weight and cow efficiency. We learned the formulas to convert raw data into standardized measurements for comparison. We typed up tables of data to supply to the people buying our cattle. And although we knew our ranch was considered a maverick by the traditional beef industry, we shared our mother's belief that we were the ones headed in the right direction. Over the next few decades, because of my mother and other forward-thinking people, the ideas that were considered crackpot in 1955 would spread through the industry, grow steadily more sophisticated, and become well established. By the time I was facing a medical decision in the 1990s, I'd had a lifetime of training in the value of good data. So when the doctor said there was nothing to do, I figured the one thing I could do was to try to educate myself. So I headed to the library. In my current dilemma, the library of choice was the one at the medical center where I had seen, still bad. Sorry. In my current dilemma, the library of choice was the one at the medical center where I had seen Dr. Sage. It had an excellent reading room for the general public, and when I scanned the shelves of books, I saw that the section on multiple sclerosis was one of the larger sections. At first I thought, great, there's lots of information. As I started reading, I discovered that the quantity of material was a measure of bafflement, not knowledge. With most common diseases, doctors have at least some solid information to impart to their patients. They may have a vaccine to prevent it, or a medication to cure it, or a treatment that at least slows its progress. They may be able to explain factors that increase risk, like smoking or sun exposure or overeating. Or if they don't know the cause or the risk factors, and they don't have a treatment, they may at least be able to describe in detail what effects the disease will have. With multiple sclerosis, the doctors could not say anything very definite about any of those things. They did not know what caused it, they did not know what factors might heighten risk, and they had no prevention measures, no cure, and only very limited symptomatic treatments. They could not even say with any certainty how the disease would manifest in a particular patient. In the early stage, the symptoms seemed to appear out of nowhere, grip the patient for some unpredictable period of time, and then disappear into the mist. Later, they might start to linger, or the disease might attack a different function. No one knew what triggered the attacks or why they went away. What scientists did understand was the how, the basic mechanism of the disease. It is an autoimmune disease, meaning that the immune system attacks the body's own tissue as if it were a pathogen. There are many different autoimmune diseases, each defined by the particular type of tissue that is affected. In the case of MS, the targeted tissue is myelin, a fatty coating that protects and insulates nerve fibers. During an MS flare-up, the cells of the immune system start attacking the protective myelin in the central nervous system, like microscopic mice chewing through the plastic insulation on the electric wires in a house. With the insulation gone, the wires develop static and short circuits. Nerve signals don't transmit properly. Depending on where and how much insulation is lost, the resulting symptoms can be anything from mild numbness and tingling to vision loss, spasticity, loss of balance, loss of bladder control, and cognitive impairment. For many people, the attacks are accompanied by debilitating fatigue. Early in the course of the disease, the attacks usually end as abruptly as they start. The body repairs the damaged myelin and the symptoms diminish or disappear. Before the MRI was developed, this relapsing, remitting pattern of symptoms had been a key marker for diagnosing MS. So I started reading, well, there's a lot of information about the disease, but most of it was in the form of things like history and epidemiology, because they were starting to work at the molecular level, and but that was kind of new. But there was a lot of information about the epidemiology, and that was what I read, and that was where I thought, geez, I looked at the map of where there's a lot of MS, and it sure looks like a map of where they drink a lot of milk. But there weren't any studies about that. There was just the studies of where the disease was common. And I mentioned this to my brother-in-law, who was a cancer researcher at NIH, and he did a search of medical journals and came up with and found out there had just been a study published, in fact, that pointed out this correlation, but nothing had been particularly done about it yet. Anyway, so then I had to decide what the sum total of the recommendations in the books was similar to what the neurologist had said. Living a healthy lifestyle and avoiding stress couldn't hurt, but there were no specific recommendations with any weight of medical research behind them. It was not that dietary strategies had been comprehensively researched and shown to be irrelevant. There just wasn't much research data on the effect of diet. Some of the questions that intrigued me, particularly about milk, had never been studied at all. So I was left to decide for myself if I wanted to do anything, or simply live my life exactly as I always had. In all of the previous instances that my family doctor had told me I didn't need to do anything, the message had meant something very different from what it meant now. In those past instances, such as my sprained thumb, he was telling me the problem would get better on its own, so I could leave it alone. That was not the message now. The message now was that the problem would do whatever it was going to do, and I just had to wait and see how bad it would get. At the time I was making the decision, I did not think about my parents or my own history. I just did what I felt driven to do. But looking back, I realized that my strategy was rooted in my history. Thanks to my mother, I wasn't good at waiting to see what happened, especially if this something might be really, really bad. I needed to take action. Thanks to my father, the action that felt logical and natural was to embark on an experiment. In this case, the lab rat would be me. Based on what I had learned about the disease, I decided to make 3 specific changes in my habits. I would stop eating any milk products whatsoever. I would start eating more vegetable oil, and I would start taking a basic multivitamin and a calcium supplement to make up for nutrients I would lose without the milk. I didn't know if these changes would help, but they could do no harm. So I can skip ahead. Basically, for the next 9 years, I had no more MS symptoms, and I sort of was starting to wonder if maybe it had just been a passing, who knows what, oddity. And then in 2004, I had, the symptoms came back. I don't know if it's significant. That flare-up did in fact coincide with one of the only times when I ate something that might have had milk in it, but it seemed like such a small amount that I had that it didn't seem like it could cause a flare-up, but who knows, it's an unknown still. But I went to a neurologist then. I got a confirmed diagnosis of MS they did comprehensive MRIs and so forth. And by then there were medications, and I saw 2 different neurologists, one of whom wanted to use the one at the medical centers wanted to use one of the drugs that had been around for a while and had a track record. And the private clinic was eager to have me try this brand new drug, a monoclonal antibody drug that had been actually fast-tracked for approval by the FDA. It was supposed to go through a 2-year trial, and they liked it so much they approved it after 1 year. So I went home to think about the information from the 2 neurologists. Trying to come to a decision, I was in a mental tug-of-war. On the one hand, although the doctors disagreed about which medication I should take, they were in agreement that I should take something. On the other hand, I hated taking drugs. For the most part, I thought my body had served me well. Apart from this little quirk that it occasionally started chewing on itself, my immune system functioned admirably. I got sick rarely and recovered quickly. The idea of putting hobbles on my immune system to slow its attack on my nervous system was a very mixed prospect. Part of my reluctance stemmed from the medical literature itself. I had read about how the various drugs worked, and it was clear that none of them targeted the cause of the illness. They were not like antibiotics that kill the organism that is making you sick, or taking vitamin C as a remedy for scurvy. The cause of MS was still unknown. Doctors didn't know what made my immune system start attacking my own tissue. Because they didn't know the cause, they couldn't treat the cause. However, they did know the agent of the disease, the T cells of the immune system. So the only strategy available was to throw up roadblocks between the T cells and their wrong-headed target in the nerves. Although the treatments tried to limit the effect of these roadblocks, they caused collateral damage. The frequency of flu symptoms as a side effect showed that the drugs affected immune function in ways other than their intended purpose. I was strongly of the mindset, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I'd been running on the same model of running shoes for 20 years without suffering any injuries, so why would I start buying a different model? For years, I used a clothespin to wedge the start button on my lovely analog dial toaster oven, postponing the day when I would have to endure all the annoying digital buttons and beeps of the newer ones. Whether it was laziness, thrift, or pathology, I wasn't the only one in my family with this attitude. When my sister and her husband moved into a retirement community, the house they left behind still had the same metal door kitchen cabinets it had had when they moved into it as a young married couple. In the matter of my health, I didn't feel broken most of the time. I had to remind myself that my immune system did have a problem and the drugs were supposed to help. But when I did the math on the potential benefit of the medications, I was not immediately won over. The older drug promised a 30% reduction in frequency of flare-ups on average. If that number held up in my case, the 9.5-year interval since my last flare would be expected to improve to 13 years before my next one. In other words, I would have to be on the drug for more than a decade before I would have a clue if it was helping me. And in the meantime, it had side effects. In a decade, I would meet lots of other threats from which the immune system protected me. So what were the odds? The doctors had wider experience with the disease than I did, and they thought the best approach was intervention. However, I had more experience with my own body, and I wasn't sure. I had mentioned my dietary regimen to both of them, and asked if there was any scientific as opposed to anecdotal information on the subject. The answer was no. There were no studies in which a statistically meaningful group of people had done what I had done. Neither of the neurologists seemed very interested in my anecdotal experience. I had the feeling that they didn't want to encourage my belief in my regimen because they were afraid I would be like the people who went off to Mexico to pursue herbal remedies instead of following a proven chemotherapy protocol for deadly cancer. From their perspective, it was vital to persuade me to take the drugs for my own good, and also to defend the whole principle of the scientific method from the quacks who peddled untested hope to desperate people. In their minds, my diet was not a treatment, but in my mind, it was a treatment. In my statistically meaningless study group of 1, I had changed my diet, and my remission period had improved more than 6-fold, going from 1.5 years to more than 9 years. That was twice as good as the fancy new drug, and 4 times as good as the old ones, with no negative side effects. If it had been a drug that gave me this result, the doctors would have said I should keep taking it. But it wasn't a drug, and it hadn't been studied. I was never in doubt that I would continue with my eating habits. The question was whether I should also take a drug, and if so, which one. I was leaning toward Dr. Blunt's philosophy to try one of the old drugs. If it had bad side effects, I could stop. But I wasn't very happy about the idea. Anyway. So, more. Well, it's too much to read tonight. I can tell you. I can tell you what I decided, but I don't want to read the whole description of how I decided. What? Yeah, so I would very much welcome questions. If people, have more that they would like to know, or just want to ask about anything. And don't be put off by gizmos, please.
Yeah. Just for question right up here in the front.
So this is the microphone?
Yeah, just speak into that.
And do I take the mask off? Or?
You're fine to leave it on.
Okay, so really great, just beautiful, beautiful language. So clean and elegant and well-paced, gorgeous, and funny. Yeah, oddly funny.
Sometimes. Now and then.
So my question is, how did you figure out it was where people drank milk?
Well, there was a lot of there was a lot of data about where the incidence was high and where it was low, and at some point I think I saw an actual map. I'm not sure, maybe I just read descriptions, but it basically was very common in the United States. It was very common in Northern Europe. It was almost unknown in China and Japan. It was very rare among Inuits. I sort of went through the whole list, and it was like, geez, that sure looks an awful lot like, and of course, correlation doesn't always mean causation. You can have 2 things that are both correlated to something else. For instance, it could be racial. There's lots of, so you don't know. But I just thought, it's like, what's the harm? I'll try anything at that point, It's like, I'm going to try something. I don't want to just sit back and wait around to see what happens.
If it was that clear with such a short look at it, why do you think other people, researchers, haven't looked at that more intensively?
Well, partly it was clear to me because I have a dual interest in agriculture. I had a lot of agricultural background, and also I love to cook. So both of those things kind of gave me a leg up on noticing that in the first place. As far as why the French study hasn't been followed up with research, it's very hard to do lifestyle studies, for one thing. Especially it's impossible to do them as a blind study, and very difficult even to do them as a truly controlled study. So they're hard to do. And I suppose the other reason is that there's really nobody with a financial incentive to do a study, so it has to be a public. You have to have either a university or a public entity that wants to pay for it. So there's that. But I think it's more the difficulty. It's also very hard to get people to change their habits. So, to expect to be able to get a whole group of people who are willing to do this, consistently enough to really get data, it's hard. But I hope they will. I'm hoping that at some point this will somehow get studied, or, on some angle. I go later in the book. I went back and did a lot of research now because I haven't since 2004. That flare-up was in 2004. I haven't had a flare-up since then. Yeah, but I went, before I started writing this, I went back and looked at what the research showed now. There still hasn't been any study of somebody, what I did, but there's tons more information now. And I found some, I was curious, well, is there anything in what they're studying now that could possibly explain this? And I found some things that were certainly very interesting leads that might be followed, that I talk about later in the book.
Other questions? I'm gonna send this over to you.
Thank you. Are any of the studies or any of the angles that might be studied, would they involve the immune system itself and what causes those little mice to eat the insulation off of those nerves? And whether milk and things that it contains might have any effect on those?
Well, that's what there's a ton of research going on now about T cells and a lot of the current medications are actually there's a whole bunch more monoclonal antibody drugs that are aimed at, like, targeting a little piece of your immune system to just kind of interrupt the pathway that would lead the T cells in. But as far as them figuring out what's triggering the attack in the first place, that there's still, every once in a while theories pop up, but they don't have anything nailed down yet. One of the things I came across was some possible, a virus that infects both cows and people that has been shown to, where T cells from an MS patient will respond to that virus from the human version of that virus. So it made me think, well, geez, that's one of the threads I talk about is, geez, maybe they'll, that path may eventually lead to more understanding, I hope. But all the, most of the research now is an extremely sophisticated level of all the extremely complicated immune system that
And
keeps
are
us.
those being run by the drug companies that are footing the bill, or?
But there's both. A lot of basic research is done in NIH or, in the government, and then often they pass the basic research on to drug companies to actually make into a product and do the clinical trials that will will get approval and stuff like that. It's kind of both prongs, but the drug companies I don't think are doing a whole lot of basic research. I think they're mostly doing sort of like the applied physics. They're doing like the applied science.
Thank you.
But I'm not an expert on that field either, so somebody here knows more.
Further question? Okay.
No.
Send it back to you.
So the process of writing a memoir, how is that different from the process of writing novels?
For me, I'd much rather write a novel just because I can make everything up. And also I don't really like talking and writing about myself that much. But in this case, actually what happened is I had my mother on my shoulder, like, you have to do something. You can't just sit on this knowledge. You have to do something with it. So, so that's why my mother is so thoroughly woven into the story, because I feel like she's kind of a lot of why, not so much why it's partly why I did what I did with the MS, but it's a lot more about why I just ultimately felt like I needed to write it down, not just write it down so that I had a record. I kind of knew I wanted to write it down so I had a record of what I'd done, but to try and actually like get it out into the world, that's like Mom mentioned, poking. She's been gone for quite a while, but she's still here.
We have other questions? Up in front. Let me send this your way. Thank you.
Alfie, I had not known that you had written novels. So this is the first experience I had with your writing, and it just was wonderful. It read like a novel in a sense. And what I thought was, we have to get the novels and read them because they're going to be just as wonderful. And we got one. They're unfortunately out of print, but you can get them. But what I wanted to know was, are you continuing to write fiction? Are you going to, now that this book, the MS book, is done, are you going to go back to writing fiction?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I actually have a manuscript that I've been working on for a while, but I got quite discouraged about the whole publication process, which has gotten really, really, really difficult.
Yeah.
And I'm not very good at it. I mean, I just, you know, I don't know. You just have to hustle so much, and I'm just not good at that. So I'm kind of just waiting to see. Right now, I'm in a stage where I am sort of still working on getting this book out into the world. But after that, I may go back and do a little more work on the novel and see about trying. But then I would really like to start on something new, because it's been quite a few years since I've had these two projects that were kind of both going on a little bit for a few years. Yeah, no, I definitely want to write.
Great. Do you want to hand this over to her?
Perfect. Like a brigade.
Oh, there you go. So, Elf, have you run into other people for whom milk has been, or keeping away from milk has helped them in either MS or any other?
I don't know anybody I don't actually know that many people very well who have MS. I mean, I have a couple of friends that are sort of at a distance. My experience with people who have MS they're like me. They don't actually want to talk about it, and it's been very much. I mean, you just don't want to focus on it, and it's very strange for me to be spending this much time thinking and talking about it. I don't know. But I know people with allergies who've said that staying away from, and that was what I experienced. I mean, that was what helped me keep going when I first went off the milk, because I mean, how was I going to know if it was helping me with the MS? But
Right.
But almost right away, it started helping with my allergies. So that was great, because then I had a reason to keep doing it, even if it had nothing to do with MS. And it was also a little bit of like, well, you know, the allergies, they're an immune system, you know.
Right.
It sort of suggested that milk might be interacting with my immune system in some way, and who knows how, but somehow.
Right.
And I've definitely met other people who say that.
Yeah.
I'm hoping I'll get feedback from people with MS one way or the other about, you know, maybe they'll all say, you know, I've been drinking milk for years and I'm fine, or I've never drunk milk and I'm doing really badly, you know. So I don't know what I'll find out.
Yeah, but you don't want to find out too much, because you've got to write the next fiction.
Right. Yeah, I'm hoping to move past this at some point, but.
Hey, Alfie. I've had two coworkers who both had MS or were diagnosed with MS, and what seemed to me that one of their issues with MS is that it's really hard to diagnose. One of them was saying basically they rule out everything else and then tell you have MS. And so I'm not sure if your situation was different, where there were specific symptoms or whatever that pointed them directly at MS, or if it was sort of a process of elimination to get to that diagnosis. And secondly, just talking a little bit about studies and stuff, have you ever looked into the Harvard nurses study and that whole group, and even look at, you know, vegans within that group, whatever, and try to, I mean, that seems like a large pool of long-term.
Oh, that would be interesting.
People.
You mean it's because it's a longitudinal study of a large group of people. Did it, and it covered all different medical conditions? Yeah. No, I should look at that. It'd be interesting to see if it had any clues. As far as the diagnosis, well, I mean, in the 90s, well, by the 90s, the MRI was the thing they were using. Before that, it was totally based on symptoms, and they, you know, and so it was, and it's also it's a hugely variable and unpredictable disease. And so the other thing that makes doctors skeptical is just some people do well without doing anything, you know. So that when you do well, you don't know if it was just your good luck. I don't know. I mean, the doctors seem to think it was a definite diagnosis based on what they saw in my MRIs, because I think it shows up pretty clearly as basically a bunch of white spots. And they were very worried about me because I had a huge lesion right in my cervical spine. And so, you know, if you have things in your brain, you've got lots of brain, but you don't have very much spine. which is, so that was one of the, so when I was defiant, it was, it was taking more of a risk than it might have been if they felt like, the damage seems to be just here and there somewhere else.
Was that in 2004?
That was 2004, yeah. Yeah. And you didn't ask, but I did decide not to take medications, and partly, it's just the probabilities in that. But I realized also, this is sort of, it's probably a crazy motivation, but I don't think I wanted to mess up my experiment. It's like, so, I don't know. Anyway.
That's your mother again.
Yes.
Elfie, were you able to, did you have any curiosity about your own family tree? Did you investigate, like going back 10 generations, or look at your own extensive family? Because you have a big family. Did
You mean
go
about
back
MS or just in general?
In general, or anything that might correlate with MS that was, if you went back generations?
Yeah. As far as I know, it's not particularly a disease that they consider to run in families, although there are, I suppose it might in the sense that certain immune system types are more prone to it than other immune system types, and so those may run in families. But it's interesting because actually my grandmother was in a wheelchair for quite a long time, and when she died, she died in the 50s, and at the time she died, they thought it might be MS, but when they autopsied her, it was not. They did not find the kind of damage that MS does, and they actually thought it looked like an infectious disease, and there was some speculation that she might have been like an incredibly early case of Lyme disease. But her actual cause of death was never known, but it was briefly thought it might be MS, but then it wasn't.
And we have time for one more question, if anybody has one. Any other questions? Going once? Going twice? Well, thank you, everybody. There will be time for you to ask more questions at once. Thank you, Edith, Elfie Forbes. The book is Tracking a Shadow. I have copies available at the back in the front room. That sounds weird to say, but behind you in the front room. And we'd be happy to sign, inscribe, and personalize copies up front here. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.